The morning of July 1st, 1863, broke quietly over the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. Most of its 2,400 residents were just beginning their daily routines when the distant rumble of artillery shattered the summer stillness. Mothers were preparing breakfast. Shopkeepers were opening their stores. Children were playing in dusty streets. None of them knew that within hours their peaceful town would become the epicenter of the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil, and that their lives would be forever changed by 3 days of unimaginable horror that would unfold in their gardens, their homes, and their very bedrooms. Gettysburg was an ordinary town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name. It sat at the crossroads of 10 different roads radiating out like the spokes of a wheel, connecting it to Baltimore, Washington, Harrisburg, and points beyond. This geography made it a natural meeting place for farmers bringing goods to market, for travelers passing through, for communities gathering. The town had grown slowly, but steadily since its founding in 1786, named after Samuel Gettys, who had established a tavern at the crossroads. By 1863, it boasted 2 newspapers, several churches of different denominations, a railroad line, dozens of shops and businesses, and Pennsylvania College, a small but respected institution of learning, perched on a hill overlooking the town. The people of Gettysburg were hard-working, God-fearing folk. Germans and Scots-Irish made up most of the population, families who had migrated westward from Philadelphia and other eastern cities seeking affordable land and opportunity. They farmed the rich soil surrounding the town, growing wheat and corn and raising livestock. They worked as blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, tailors, and merchants. Their lives followed the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of their labors. Sundays meant church, where Protestant hymns rose from several congregations, and where the small but established Catholic community gathered at St. Francis Xavier Church. The town had a German Reformed church, a Lutheran church, a Presbyterian church, and others, reflecting the diverse origins of its settlers. Among these residents was John Burns, a 70-year-old veteran of the War of 1812, a cantankerous old man with fierce patriotic pride who served as the town constable. There was Elizabeth Thorne, the caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery on the hill south of town, 6 months pregnant and managing the grounds while her husband served in the Union Army. There was Tilly Pierce, a 15-year-old girl who lived on Baltimore Street with her family, whose father owned a butcher shop. There was Jennie Wade, 20 years old, known to friends as Ginny, who worked as a seamstress and was engaged to a corporal named Johnston Skelly, serving with the Union forces. There was Albertus McCreary, a young boy who would later remember every terrifying detail of what he witnessed. There were the Schmucker family members, connected to the theological seminary on the ridge west of town. There were freed African Americans who had made Gettysburg their home, including Abraham Bryan, who owned a small farm on Cemetery Hill, and Mag Palm, a well-known figure in the community. These people were about to experience something that no amount of newspaper reading or political debate could have prepared them for. The Civil War had been raging for 2 years, but it had remained distant from Gettysburg, something discussed in parlors and debated in shops, but never truly felt. Now it was coming to them with the force of an avalanche. The tension had been building for weeks. In June, word had spread through the town that Confederate forces were moving north through Maryland, heading into Pennsylvania. General Robert E. Lee had launched his second invasion of the North, hoping to win a decisive victory on Union soil that might convince the war-weary northern population to sue for peace. The Army of Northern Virginia, flush with confidence after victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, was marching through the Cumberland Valley, requisitioning supplies, spreading fear, and drawing the Union Army of the Potomac after it. On June 26th, Confederate cavalry had ridden into Gettysburg. The townspeople watched in shock and fear as hundreds of gray-clad soldiers on horseback trotted down the streets. The Confederates were polite but firm, demanding supplies, food, clothing, and shoes. They paid in Confederate currency, which the merchants knew was worthless in the North. They searched homes and stores, taking what they needed. Then they left, moving westward, leaving the town shaken but relatively unharmed. But the residents knew the soldiers would return. Throughout late June, refugees from other Pennsylvania towns streamed through Gettysburg, fleeing ahead of the Confederate advance. They brought stories of occupied towns, of supplies seized, of homes ransacked. Fear gripped the civilian population. Those who had the means began packing their valuables and preparing to flee. Others, unable or unwilling to abandon their homes and businesses, began hiding their most precious possessions, burying silver in gardens, concealing hams and flour in cellars, sending their horses away to prevent Confederate seizure. The African-American residents faced a particular terror. The Confederate Army had been capturing free black people in Pennsylvania and Maryland and sending them south into slavery. Families that had lived free for generations, that had built lives and businesses in the North, now faced the nightmare of being kidnapped and enslaved. Many fled north to Harrisburg or farther, carrying what they could, leaving behind homes and livelihoods rather than risk capture. Abraham Bryan, however, chose to stay, trusting that his position as a property owner and his integration into the white community would offer some protection. It was a gamble that would see his farm become a battlefield and his home destroyed. As June turned to July, the town existed in a state of anxious waiting. Union cavalry had been passing through periodically, reassuring the citizens that the Army of the Potomac was nearby and would protect them. But on the evening of June 30th, most of the Union cavalry left town, riding west to investigate reports of Confederate movements. This left Gettysburg with minimal military presence, just some scattered units, as both armies converged on the crossroads from different directions, neither fully aware of the other's exact position. The morning of July 1st began with that deceptive peace. Then, around 7:30 in the morning, shots rang out northwest of town. Union cavalry under General John Buford had encountered Confederate infantry advancing along the Chambersburg Pike. Within minutes, the skirmishing escalated. The sound of musket fire crackled through the air, growing more intense. Then came the deeper boom of artillery. The civilians of Gettysburg rushed to their windows, climbed to their roofs, strained to see what was happening beyond the town's edge. What they saw filled them with dread. Long lines of soldiers in blue were forming battle positions on the ridges west and north of town. Columns of Confederate soldiers in gray and butternut brown were deploying from the roads, spreading out into battle formations. Artillery batteries unlimbered and began firing, the shells screaming through the air before exploding in bursts of smoke and destruction. This was no skirmish. This was a full-scale battle, and it was happening on their doorstep. Panic seized many of the residents. Families grabbed what they could and ran, heading south out of town toward the perceived safety of the hills beyond. Others, paralyzed by fear or convinced their homes offered the best protection, retreated to their cellars. The streets became chaos as civilians tried to flee while Union troops rushed through town to reinforce the fighting lines to the west and north. Wounded soldiers began streaming back into town, blood-soaked and crying out in pain, collapsing in the streets, seeking help at any door. Elizabeth Thorne, up at Evergreen Cemetery, could see the entire battle unfolding below her. Her cemetery sat on a strategic hill, and she knew it would not remain peaceful for long. With her elderly parents and her young children, she watched as the fighting intensified. The Union forces were outnumbered and being pushed back. By early afternoon, the Confederate attackers had broken through the Union lines both west and north of town. Federal soldiers came streaming back in retreat, running through the streets in disorder, seeking safety on the hills south of town, the very hill where Elizabeth Thorne stood, where her cemetery would soon become fortified Union headquarters. The retreating Union soldiers ran through the streets of Gettysburg, with Confederate forces in pursuit. Musket balls whizzed through the air, smashing through windows, thudding into walls. Shells exploded in intersections. Civilians cowering in their basements could hear the boots thundering overhead, the shouts of officers, the screams of the wounded, the crash of gunfire. Some soldiers, desperate to escape capture, burst into homes seeking places to hide. Others, too wounded to continue, collapsed in yards and on porches, begging for help. The Pierce family, including 15-year-old Tilly, had taken refuge in their basement on Baltimore Street when the battle erupted. But as wounded soldiers began filling the streets and the fighting moved into the town itself, neighbors came pounding on their door. A family friend, a farmer named Jacob Weichert, who lived south of town, urged them to flee with him to his farm, which was farther from the fighting. Tilly's parents agreed. The girl gathered a few belongings and left with the Weikert family, running south through streets filled with retreating soldiers and the debris of battle. She would not see her own home again for days, and when she did, it would be transformed into a hospital filled with suffering men. By mid-afternoon on July 1st, Confederate forces controlled Gettysburg. They had pushed the Union Army through and out of the town, capturing hundreds of Federal soldiers who had been unable to escape. But the Union forces had not been destroyed. They had retreated to strong defensive positions on the hills, south and east of town, forming a line that looked, from above, like a giant fishhook. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the ridge extending south toward two rocky hills called Little Round Top and Big Round Top all became fortified Union positions. The Confederates held the town and the ridges to the west and north. The civilians who remained in Gettysburg now found themselves in occupied territory. Confederate soldiers moved through the streets, commandeering buildings for headquarters and hospitals. They were generally respectful to civilians, but their presence was overwhelming and terrifying. The residents could do nothing but watch as thousands of armed men in gray took control of their town. Some soldiers knocked politely on doors, requesting food and water. Others simply took what they needed. The line between requisition and looting could be thin. That first night, July 1st into July 2nd, the civilians who remained in town existed in a nightmare landscape. Their homes were filled or surrounded by soldiers. Wounded men lay in the streets, in yards, crying out for water and help in the darkness. The townspeople, despite their fear of the occupying Confederate forces, could not ignore the suffering. Women brought water to wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederate. They tore up sheets for bandages. They opened their homes to be used as hospitals, knowing they had no real choice in the matter. Every church, every public building, and many private homes were converted into makeshift medical facilities. The floors were covered with wounded men, packed so tightly there was barely room to walk between them. Jennie Wade and her mother had taken refuge at the home of Jennie's sister, Georgia McClellan, who lived on Baltimore Street with her newborn baby. Georgia's husband was away serving in the Union Army. The women felt safer together, and Jennie wanted to help care for her sister and the infant. They spent that first night in the basement while Confederate sharpshooters took up positions in the house and the surrounding area, firing toward the Union lines on Cemetery Hill, just a few hundred yards away. The morning of July 2nd brought no relief. The battle resumed with intensity. While much of the heaviest fighting that day occurred south of town, at places called the Peach Orchard, the Wheatfield, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top, the town itself remained a dangerous no-man's land. Union and Confederate forces exchanged artillery fire across it. Sharpshooters on both sides took shots at any movement. Civilians remained trapped in their basements, listening to the thunder of cannon, the crack of rifles, the whistling of bullets and shells overhead. In the cellar of Georgia McClellan's house, Jennie Wade had decided that despite the danger, she needed to bake bread. The soldiers, both Confederate troops nearby and the Union forces they could not reach, needed food. Her sister needed food. The baby needed her mother strong. So Jennie climbed up from the basement to the kitchen and began mixing dough. Her mother begged her to come back down, but Jennie was determined. She had always been strong-willed, always ready to help others, always brave. Around 8:30 in the morning on July 3rd, Jennie was kneading dough in the kitchen when a Confederate sharpshooter, positioned in a nearby house, fired toward suspected Union positions. The bullet passed through two doors before striking Jennie Wade in the back. It pierced her heart. She fell to the floor, killed instantly. She was the only civilian to die from direct combat action during the Battle of Gettysburg. 20 years old, engaged to be married, killed while baking bread to feed hungry soldiers. Her mother's screams brought neighbors rushing, but there was nothing to be done. Her body could not be removed from the house immediately, not with bullets still flying. They wrapped her in a blanket and placed her in the basement until the fighting ended. That same day, July 3rd, the battle reached its terrible climax. Confederate General Lee ordered a massive assault on the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. Around 1 in the afternoon, Confederate artillery opened up with the largest bombardment ever seen in the Western Hemisphere up to that point. Over 150 Confederate cannons fired simultaneously, and more than 80 Union cannons answered. The earth shook. The sound was beyond deafening. It was felt in the bones in the chest, stopping breath with its concussive force. In the town, between the two armies, the civilians experienced this barrage from the middle. Shells screamed overhead in both directions. Buildings were hit. Walls collapsed. Fires started. The air filled with smoke and dust and flying debris. Elizabeth Thorne, still at the cemetery with her children and parents, huddled in the gatehouse as shells exploded around them. The cemetery had become the Union headquarters. General Meade's command post was right there. This made it a prime target for Confederate artillery. Shells smashed into gravestones, throwing fragments of marble and granite through the air. One shell crashed into the gatehouse where the Thorne family sheltered, but miraculously did not explode. They survived, terrified, deafened, choking on dust, but alive. In the town, families pressed themselves against cellar walls, praying that the ceiling above them would hold. Some buildings took direct hits. The Lutheran Theological Seminary's building on the ridge west of town had been used by both armies and showed the scars of battle. The Pennsylvania College building had been converted into a Confederate hospital. Christ Lutheran Church, the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, all were filled with wounded. The shells did not discriminate. They struck military and civilian structures alike. After nearly 2 hours, the bombardment ceased. An eerie quiet fell, even more unnerving than the noise had been. Then came the sound of thousands of men advancing. Pickett's charge, as it would become known, was underway. Nearly 12,500 Confederate soldiers advanced across 3/4 of a mile of open ground toward the Union center. The civilians could not see it from their basements, but they could hear it. The renewed crash of artillery as Union guns opened up on the advancing Confederates. The rattle of musket fire as the Union infantry opened up. The rebel yell, that terrifying high-pitched scream that Confederate soldiers gave as they charged. And then, gradually, the firing diminished. The charge had failed. The Confederates were retreating. The battle was effectively over. But the civilians of Gettysburg did not know this immediately. They remained in their shelters, afraid to emerge, waiting for some sign that it was safe. Gradually, cautiously, as the afternoon of July 3rd wore on and the sounds of battle did not resume, people began to venture out. What they found was beyond their worst imaginings. The town was destroyed. Buildings were riddled with bullet holes. Some had shell damage. Others had been burned. The streets were littered with debris, abandoned equipment, dead horses, and blood. So much blood, but worse than the damage to property was the human cost spread out before them. Wounded soldiers lay everywhere. In the streets, in the yards, on the porches, in every available building. The town's population of 2,400 was now surrounded by over 22,000 wounded men from both armies. Thousands more dead bodies lay on the fields surrounding the town. The smell hit the civilians as soon as they emerged from their basements. In the July heat, death announced itself with overwhelming force. The sweet, sickening stench of decaying flesh mixed with the coppery smell of fresh blood, the waste of men who had lost control of bodily functions in death or agony, the smoke still hanging in the air from exploded shells and burned buildings. It was a smell that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, triggering memories years later when they caught an echo of it on the wind. The civilians, traumatized and exhausted, had no time to process their own shock. The wounded needed help immediately. Despite having lived through 3 days of terror, despite having their homes occupied and destroyed, despite having just emerged from cowering in cellars, the people of Gettysburg went to work. Women who had never seen blood before began tending wounds. Men organized to collect the injured and bring them to hospitals. Teenagers carried water to hundreds of suffering soldiers. Children ran errands, bringing supplies, delivering messages. Imagine this. It's a hot July day in your quiet hometown. The sun is shining, birds are singing, and the biggest news is probably the price of peaches at the local market. Now imagine that within hours, your town becomes the epicenter of the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. This wasn't a movie plot. This was the reality for the 2,400 residents of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in July 1863. Before the first shots were fired, Gettysburg was just a small, bustling crossroads town. It was a place of churches, schools, carriage makers, and tanneries. People like John Burns, a 69-year-old shoemaker and town constable, or Jennie Wade, a 20-year-old seamstress, lived ordinary lives, completely unaware that their names would soon be etched into history. The trouble started on the morning of July 1st. Many civilians, hearing the distant rumble of cannons, thought it was just a skirmish, something that would pass by. They climbed to their rooftops or the top of Cemetery Hill to get a better view, treating it almost like a spectator sport. But the sound grew louder, closer. The show was coming directly to their front doors. As the Union Army was pushed back through the town streets, the reality of the situation crashed down. Soldiers poured into houses, barricading windows and turning homes into fortresses. The once peaceful streets became a terrifying maze of gunfire, smoke, and shouting men. Civilians had to make a split-second decision: flee or hide. Many chose to hide, cramming themselves into the darkest corners of their cellars. Imagine dozens of people, men, women, children, and even some terrified soldiers, huddled together in musty, dark basements for 3 straight days. The only light came from a single candle, and the only sounds were the constant roar of battle overhead, the thud of cannonballs hitting their homes, and the cries of the wounded. The cellar of the Shriver family home, for example, became a makeshift shelter for several families. In another home, the family of Harvey Swaney hid in their basement, while Confederate sharpshooters took over the upper floors. They could hear the soldiers walking, talking, and firing right above their heads. For 3 days, their world shrank to the size of that dark, damp room, with the fate of the nation being decided just a few feet away. Not everyone hid. Some, like John Burns, decided they couldn't just stand by. Despite his age, the old veteran of the War of 1812 grabbed his antique flintlock musket, found a Union officer, and asked to join the fight. He fought alongside the famed Iron Brigade and was wounded 3 times before being left on the battlefield. His stubborn courage made him a national hero overnight. Then there's the tragic story of Jennie Wade. On the morning of July 3rd, she was in her sister's kitchen on Baltimore Street, kneading dough to bake bread for the Union soldiers. The house was caught in the crossfire between the 2 armies. A stray bullet, fired by a Confederate soldier over 500 yards away, ripped through 2 wooden doors and struck Jennie, killing her instantly. She became the only civilian directly killed during the battle, a heartbreaking symbol of how war spares no one. When the guns finally fell silent on the evening of July 3rd, the people of Gettysburg emerged from their cellars not to relief, but to a scene of absolute horror. Their town was gone. In its place was a vast, open-air hospital and graveyard. The sight, sound, and smell were overwhelming. Every church, school, barn, and public building was overflowing with wounded soldiers. Thousands more lay in the fields, crying out for help. The streets were littered with the bodies of men and horses, broken wagons, and discarded equipment. The air was thick with the stench of death and disease. Streams literally ran red with blood. The small community of 2,400 people was suddenly faced with caring for over 20,000 wounded soldiers from both sides. The townspeople, who had just endured 3 days of terror, didn't hesitate. They opened their homes, which were already damaged, and ransacked. They tore up their own sheets for bandages, cooked what little food they had, and brought water to the thirsty and dying. Women like Elizabeth Thorne, the wife of the Evergreen Cemetery's caretaker, became unsung heroes. With her husband away fighting in the war, Elizabeth, who was 6 months pregnant, was left to bury nearly 100 soldiers by herself in the July heat. Can you even fathom that kind of strength and duty? Another local, a free African-American man named Basil Biggs, was hired by the state to lead the massive effort of disinterring the Union dead from their shallow battlefield graves and reburying them in the new Soldiers' National Cemetery. It was a gruesome, heartbreaking task, but essential for honoring the fallen. The aftermath was in some ways worse than the battle itself. For weeks and months, Gettysburg was a town of suffering. Disease, like typhoid and dysentery, ran rampant due to the thousands of decomposing bodies and poor sanitation. The emotional and psychological toll on the citizens was immeasurable. Many of them would be haunted for the rest of their lives by what they saw. Slowly, painstakingly, They began to rebuild. They repaired their homes, replanted their fields, and tried to find a new sense of normalcy. But the town was forever changed. It was no longer just Gettysburg. It was Gettysburg, a name that would forever be synonymous with sacrifice and the turning point of the Civil War. 4 months later, in November 1863, President Abraham Lincoln arrived to dedicate the new National Cemetery. He stood on a platform and delivered a short speech, his famous Gettysburg Address. He spoke of a new birth of freedom and a government of the people, by the people, for the civilians who had lived through the nightmare, who had cared for the wounded and buried the dead. Those words must have held a profound and deeply personal meaning. They had seen the true cost of that freedom firsthand. The story of the civilians of Gettysburg is a powerful reminder that wars are not just fought by soldiers on battlefields. They are endured by ordinary people in their homes, in their streets, and in their hearts. Their resilience, compassion, and unwavering spirit in the face of unimaginable horror is a crucial and often overlooked part of the Gettysburg story. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as moving as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories. Let me know in the comments which part of the civilian story stood out to you the most. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we re-journeying back in time to a small town in Pennsylvania that became the stage for one of the most pivotal moments in American history. But we're not just talking about the 3 days of brutal fighting at Gettysburg. We're exploring what happened after the cannons fell silent. This is the story of the legacy of Gettysburg, a tale of dedication, trauma, and transformation that reshaped a town and a nation forever. Imagine the scene. July 4th, 1863. The battle is over, but the horror has just begun. The town of Gettysburg, with only 2,400 residents, is now a massive open-air hospital and graveyard. Over 51,000 soldiers are dead, wounded, or missing. The stench of death hangs heavy in the summer air. Every church, every school, every barn is overflowing with wounded men. The fields are littered with the bodies of soldiers and horses, bloating under the July sun. This wasn't just a battlefield. It was a humanitarian crisis on an unimaginable scale. The small community was left to deal with the overwhelming aftermath, a task that would define them for generations. In the midst of this chaos, a monumental effort began. A local attorney named David Wills proposed the creation of a national cemetery to give the Union dead a proper, final resting place. This was a revolutionary idea at the time. The government commissioned the reinterment of over 3,500 Union soldiers from their shallow, temporary graves on the battlefield. It was a grim and difficult task, but it was driven by a profound need to honor their sacrifice. This effort culminated on November 19, 1863, with the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. The main speaker that day was a famous orator named Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours. But it was the man who followed him, President Abraham Lincoln, who would make history. In just 272 words, and in under 3 minutes, Lincoln delivered what would become known as the Gettysburg Address. He didn't just dedicate a cemetery. He redefined the purpose of the Civil War. He spoke of a new birth of freedom and declared that the nation was fighting to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. His brief, powerful words transformed Gettysburg from a site of horrific bloodshed into a symbol of American democracy and enduring hope. These words still echo today, reminding us of the ideals the soldiers fought and died for. But for the people of Gettysburg, the war's impact was deeply personal and traumatic. The sights, sounds, and smells of the battle were seared into their memories. Imagine being a child and seeing your family's farm turned into a field hospital, your home filled with the cries of wounded men. Farmers returned to find their crops destroyed, their fences torn down for firewood, and their fields riddled with unexploded shells and the graves of soldiers. The psychological toll was immense. For decades, residents suffered from what we would now recognize as PTSD. The trauma of the battle became a silent, ever-present ghost in the community. And the danger didn't end when the soldiers left. For years, residents had to be careful where they walked. Unexploded ordnance littered the landscape, and tragic accidents were common. Boys playing in the fields would sometimes discover live shells, leading to devastating consequences. The physical scars on the land were matched by the emotional scars on its people. The process of cleaning up and rebuilding was not a matter of weeks or months, but of years, a constant, painful reminder of the violence that had torn their world apart. Amidst the stories of soldiers, there are countless civilian tales of bravery and tragedy. Perhaps one of the most poignant is that of Jennie Wade. A 20-year-old resident, Jennie was in her sister's kitchen, baking bread for Union soldiers on the morning of July 3rd. Suddenly, a stray Confederate bullet flew through 2 wooden doors and struck her, killing her instantly. Jennie Wade became the only civilian directly killed during the battle. Her story is a powerful reminder that war doesn't just happen on the battlefield. It spills into the homes and lives of ordinary people, forever changing them. Her house still stands today, a somber monument to the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. Now, let's talk about a part of Gettysburg's story that is often overlooked, the experience of its black community. Before the war, Gettysburg had a small but vibrant free black population. Many were active in the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves find their way to freedom. When the Confederate Army invaded Pennsylvania, they didn't just see it as enemy territory. They saw it as an opportunity to capture and enslave free black citizens. Dozens of black residents from Gettysburg and the surrounding areas were kidnapped and forced south into slavery. For them, the arrival of the Confederate Army was not just a threat to their nation, but a direct threat to their freedom and their lives. The battle for freedom at Gettysburg was, for them, a terrifyingly literal fight. After the war, the black community continued to play a vital role. Some black veterans of the United States colored troops even settled in Gettysburg. They built their own churches and schools and organized Emancipation Day celebrations for decades, long before the battle was widely commemorated. Their story is a crucial part of Gettysburg's legacy, representing the very new birth of freedom that Lincoln spoke of. They celebrated the end of slavery and the promise of a more equal nation, a promise forged in the fires of the war that had raged through their town. In the decades that followed, Gettysburg began a remarkable transformation. The battlefield, once a scene of carnage, slowly became a place of reconciliation and remembrance. Veterans from both the North and the South began returning to the fields where they had once fought. They walked the lines, shared stories, and even shook hands across the stone walls they had once defended. The 50th anniversary in 1913 was a particularly powerful moment, with over 50,000 veterans, Union and Confederate, gathering for a great reunion. The image of old enemies embracing became a potent symbol of a nation trying to heal its deepest wounds. This process of remembrance led to the creation of the Gettysburg National Military Park. The battlefield was preserved, not to glorify war, but to teach future generations about its costs. Hundreds of monuments, large and small, were erected by veterans groups to mark where their regiments fought and fell. Each monument tells a story of courage, sacrifice, and loss. Walking through Gettysburg today is like walking through a history book written in stone and bronze. It's a landscape of memory, a physical testament to the events that transpired there. So, the legacy of Gettysburg is far more complex than just a battle. It's the story of a community's resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. It's the story of Lincoln's words giving new meaning to a nation's struggle. It's the story of Jennie Wade, representing the countless innocent lives affected by war. It's the story of a black community fighting for its own freedom. And ultimately, it's the story of a battlefield transforming into a classroom for the world, a place where we can reflect on the price of liberty and the enduring challenge of creating a more perfect union. Gettysburg teaches us that the end of a battle is never the end of the story. The echoes of those 3 days in July 1863 continue to resonate, reminding us of the sacrifices made and the ideals we still strive for. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the legacy of Gettysburg. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what part of Gettysburg's legacy you find most powerful. Until next time, stay curious. But for the civilians who had lived through it, Gettysburg was not primarily a symbol. It was a personal trauma, a communal catastrophe, a wound that never fully healed. They appreciated that something important had happened in their town, that history had turned on their streets and fields. But they also paid a price, that was rarely acknowledged in the grand narratives of the battle. While military historians debated tactics and strategies, while veterans reminisced about their valor and sacrifice, the civilians of Gettysburg quietly bore the weight of what they had endured. Decades after the battle, survivors would gather to share memories. They would return to the now peaceful fields, walking paths they had once run in terror. They would stand in their homes, rebuilt or repaired, and remember the basements where they had cowered, the rooms where they had tended the wounded, the kitchens where they had prepared food for armies. And they would wonder at how they had survived, how they had found the strength to endure, how their small town had absorbed so much suffering and somehow continued to exist. They had not chosen to be part of history, had not wanted their homes to become battlefields and hospitals, had not asked to witness the worst of war. Their experience reminds us that war's victims extend far beyond those who wear uniforms, and that the greatest acts of heroism are sometimes performed not on battlefields, but in basements and kitchens by ordinary people who simply refuse to abandon their humanity in the face of unimaginable horror, teaching us that in our own time, when the world seems to be tearing itself apart, the quiet courage of those who maintain compassion in the face of cruelty remains the most powerful force for holding civilization together.